The UK's Parliament has passed the Brexit bill, clearing the way for the government to start the formal process of leaving the European Union. Now, Prime Minister Theresa May is now expected to trigger Article 50 before the end of the month. Meanwhile, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has plans to hold a second referendum on Scottish independence at roughly the same time the UK would leave the EU, so by about the end of 2018 or 2019, early 2019. Well, Scotland is one of the four countries that make up the UK, along with England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Well, I'm joined now by the economist, Vicky Pryce, who is in London. Vicky, thanks so much for joining us on Money Talks again. I just want to ask you, do you think that Scotland would be better off leaving the UK so that it can stay in the EU, assuming that all the other sort of hurdles could be got over?
Well, the economics don't look very good for them, I have to say. They have quite a big sort of budget deficit. They have real problems right now with the oil price being quite low, even though it's come up recently. It's really not at levels that would make anyone feel comfortable about this. So being on their own with limited access, or at least with difficulty in terms of how they trade with the UK, which is the main export and import actually, but main export area for them, will be a real problem if they're outside the union that we have at present. So I think economically it doesn't look that good. But of course, politically, it's a different issue altogether. There's a big question mark as to whether they would get the second referendum to actually come with a yes, let's leave the union. But of course, then you don't know at all what the reaction of the Europeans is likely to be in terms of accepting them fully into the EU. Which would be an issue.
That's a very good point, because only today we heard Spain saying that if Scotland left the UK, it would have to reapply. It couldn't just, turn up and say, well, we were here before. Of course, that's a warning really to its own sort of secessionist-minded regions, Catalan and so on. Do you think that Scotland could get through that hurdle of reapplying as a new independent country?
Well, if it was an independent country, then it has every right to apply. And the reality is that they have tended not to say no to anyone unless they're not fully fledged democracies. After all, Scotland is. And also having serious difficulties in terms of the way their market economy works. So I think they would be accepted, even though obviously Spain and others who would be concerned about their own regions wanting to do the same would have some reservations. But they'd have to have a very good reason for not accepting them. Of course, they have to pass everything through the parliament and so on. So it will be a bit of a hurdle. The other question is what currency Scotland will have to adopt. Because, of course, one of the reasons why they all decided, even though it was with a sort of 10% majority, to stay in the referendum that was held a few years ago was because they were very worried about wanting, in fact, to keep the pound. And they were a bit concerned that separately, away from the UK, they may not be able to, and they may have to join the euro. Now, there's a big question mark as to what currency they would have and whether the euro would be good news for Scotland or not. That's something that's been debated in the UK press a lot today.
Just time for one last question, Vicky. The UK's economy does keep growing. Are you ready to admit that Brexit wasn't a complete disaster after all?
Well, it's very interesting. The UK has done quite well. It's been very resilient, but to a considerable extent it's because interest rates came down. There was a huge injection of funds into the economy, and the reality is that what is keeping the economy going right now is just household spending, with huge borrowings taking place. The consumer is already reining back. Retail sales have been falling actually in the last few months, and they're not borrowing as much as they did before in terms of the rates of growth that they had. So I think there is a serious problem, huge uncertainty ahead. We've seen that in terms of what the market thinks in relation to growth prospects with the fall in sterling we saw today. So I think actually all that's happened is that the pain has been postponed.
OK, Vicky Pryce in London, thank you so much for your analysis.